And the winner of the professions and legal category and the overall winner of the awards for 2020 is Lyma Nguyen. And Lyma, who joins us from Darwin, has Lyma has a bunch of friends in the background of her chambers. I'll just introduce Lyma, but thanks for all of the support team. And I must say the judges were just overwhelmed by Lyma's candidacy. Lyma, for those of you that do not know Lyma yet, has provided over 10 years of pro bono legal services to hundreds of victims of the Khmer Rouge regime, including foreign nationals and member of the Cambodian diaspora, plus ethnic Vietnamese civilians who were the subject of genocide atrocities. Dealing with contemporary human rights and statelessness concerns, Lyma is deemed an international expert in nationality laws, also practicing at the bar in Darwin. Her work predominantly focuses on criminal cases, but also includes youth justice, mental health, human rights, admin law, disciplinary committees, and tribunal matters. The judges were incredibly moved by the impact you've had, Lyma, on both locally and on the global stage. And I'd like now to pass over to you for your acceptance speech. Thank you, Lyma.
Thank you, Jason, for such a warm welcoming. I also acknowledge all my friends and supporters and colleagues here who I have in chambers to celebrate this very special event with me today. It is with gratitude that I come before you to accept this award, and in doing so, I must reflect on how fortunate I have been to have come from nothing to become something. I've never forgotten my humble beginnings, commencing with my birth at Kuku Island refugee camp in Indonesia. I was only a few months old when my family were formally recognised as asylum seekers. We lived at Galang refugee camp, close to the border with Singapore, for about 1.5 years, wondering where in the world we would end up. In 1983, my family were granted a humanitarian visa, permitting us to settle in Australia. I grew up in the Brisbane suburb of Darra, in what I have often referred to in jest as the Vietnamese ghetto. I recall my grade 1 teacher at Darra State Primary School teasing me about my shoes flipping and flopping on my feet because they were a few sizes too big. My family, when we first came to Australia, wore mixed matched clothing donated to us by the Red Cross, St. Vincent de Paul, and Salvation Army. And our family trips to the dump were also a treasure hunt, as we often used to find toys that were thrown away. I got my very first guitar from the dump. And of course, I learned how to play music from that. So on reflection, my prevailing love for op shopping must have derived from my fond memories of those days where trash and treasure were one and the same. This lovely dress that I'm wearing is from St. Vincent de Paul, and I'm proud of it. Yeah. I left home at the age of 17, and I have had no firm life plans. I did not commence my university studies at the University of Queensland with law. Instead, I studied philosophy, peace and conflict studies, history, religion, psychology, just random subjects about which I liked to ponder. It was only after realising that if any real change were to take effect in the areas of human rights, social justice, and peace, it was more likely to be within the realm of international and domestic legal frameworks than as an armchair philosopher that prompted me to study law. In my 20s, I travelled extensively, volunteering in places like East Timor, Nigeria, doing an international club trip in Singapore, backpacking Europe, trying to explore the depths of my inner and outer world. I recall that when returning to Australia, Australian customs would often stop me at the airport and ask me to step aside. They would then carefully take out items from my luggage and scrutinise those items to the point of reading my personal journal. It took me a while to figure out that it was because I was profiled as a drug smuggler. Well, it does make sense, doesn't it, when you have Nguyen as your surname, when you have an address in Darra when you have a place of birth on your passport as Cuckoo Island, and entry stamps from and to major source countries such as Nigeria and Singapore, and then being an Asian Australian immigrant at the time, flying through another drug port, Sydney, on my way home. So it all fell into place. Now, in legal practice, words are the tool of our trade. Words are black and white on a page, but life is never black and white. The stories and lives that I've come across in my practice are multidimensional, multicolored, multi-layered paintings of lived experiences reflecting many human conditions and possible realities. I believe that we are all equal before the law, and I live that out when I represent clients before courts and tribunals, both international and domestic. In my last Supreme Court trial, I defended an elderly Indonesian fisherman, the master of a foreign vessel alleged to have fished in Australian waters. After having spent 3 days in prison and 3 months in immigration detention, he was back in Australia to face trial for the 3rd time in the same case. In the middle of that 3rd trial, he became involuntarily detained in a psychiatric unit of the Royal Darwin Hospital, and I found myself back and forth between the hospital and the court. My role at that juncture had become much more than just being his barrister. My client had suicidal ideation, and the trial at that point had to stop. For him, that case was a matter of life and death. When I defend Indonesian fishermen who find themselves before criminal courts in Australia, prosecuted with the offence of fishing illegally in Australian waters, I never forget that my parents came by boat to their country, Indonesia, and without anybody's permission, my mother gave birth to me on their soil. We were not punished for this apparent act against their sovereignty, not the way that asylum seekers who find themselves detained indefinitely in outback Australia or on Nauru or Manus Island are punished for their mode of arrival in Australia by boat. I've been asked whether I have experienced discrimination in the legal profession. Discrimination can be nuanced and appears in many forms, and it's difficult to discern whether any adverse treatment that I have faced has been based on being a woman in a traditionally male-dominated profession, or due to my Asian appearance that has a tendency to be perceived as looking younger than my age or being inexperienced. I can say that during the years when I represented genocide victims at the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, I was often asked, "Who are you interning to?" I was, in fact, international counsel, working alongside National Cambodian Council, representing victims of mass and historical crimes before the tribunal. However, it was probably not an unwarranted question because I was only 27 at the time. I probably looked 17. My client group in that international court were the ethnic Vietnamese minority who had resided in Cambodia on the floating villages of the Tonle Sap River for generations. The tribunal ultimately found that the Khmer Rouge senior leadership committed acts of genocide against this group, and my clients had survived because they had been forcibly removed to Vietnam, which in itself was deemed to be a crime against humanity. The Vietnamese government, in an effort to save lives, exchanged bags of salt, and that was the reason my clients were able to survive. They had been traded with salt and were able to reside in Vietnam whilst mass executions took place against members of the group in Cambodia. My work with this group uncovered that genocidal acts against this group had generational impact, including present-day social marginalisation and lack of identity in Cambodia. An unforgettable moment for me in my work was when the village chief of my client's village presented me with 2 rare fish from the Tonle Sap River, which she had carefully dried, salted, wrapped up in the Phnom Penh newspaper, ready for me to take back to my parents in Australia. Of course, all I could think about was Australian customs and the strict airport quarantine regulations at the border. But looking back, That situation was one of the greatest expressions of appreciation that I have received from my clients who could never afford private legal representation. Fishing was their livelihood, and this was their way of saying thank you. In June 2018, I was qualified by the International Criminal Court to be referred cases to represent victims of atrocity crimes or accused persons charged with those crimes. I considered this to be a milestone in my career. However, in the very same week, a jury trial before the Supreme Court in Darwin, an elderly white male acting judge made it clear to me that he did not like me. I was berated and castigated in a manner I hadn't experienced before. It was suggested by this man that I needed to prove my legal qualifications. It remains unknown to me the true reason behind the judge's obvious disdain towards me, but it may be another example of subtle discrimination. Perhaps it's still the case that Asian women are expected to behave meekly rather than robustly, even in the courtroom. Judicial bullying has become an issue very close to my heart. There is a significant power imbalance in the courtroom, and judges must realise the devastating impacts their words and conduct may have on those tasked with appearing before them. I have learned that in my profession, you can only succeed if you have a sense of who you truly are at core. You cannot let yourself be blown this way and that by the wind in all directions. You will represent high-profile cases, unpopular cases, you will represent corporations, and then you will represent the underdog. You cannot rely on being loved and glorified by some, and then hated and berated by others. Dealing with grueling judges and difficult clients will test your limitations and boundaries each and every day. Being the winner of the 2020 Asian Australian Leadership Awards is an extraordinary honour. It might have been that I could have ended up by potluck anywhere else in the world into any other situation. But here I am in Australia with the privilege of an Australian education and fulfilling work. Australia's Asian heritage is an enormous asset to this country, and cultural diversity in leadership needs to be a priority if we are to ensure multidimensional perspectives in positions of influence. I'd like to thank Johnson Partners, Australian National University, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and Asialink, and the organisers of this noble endeavour for your initiative. And I do hope that this time next year, we will be able to come together face to face to continue to be inspired and to celebrate diversity in leadership across so many important sectors of our Australian community. Thank you very much. And I'd just like to share with you the view from my chambers of all my friends and supporters.